Okay, go right ahead.
What is today?
The 11th, January 11th.
Good afternoon. This is January 11th, 2019, and my name is Gareth Aden. And it's my pleasure to be here on behalf of the Nashville Bar Association's Oral History Project to talk with one of the prominent trial lawyers of my lifetime, John Wagster. John, good afternoon.
Thank you, and good afternoon, Gareth. Nice to be here.
Could we start at the beginning and let us know your full name and your date of birth?
Okay, my full name is John Westall Wagster. My mother's surname was Westall. And I was born in Columbia, Tennessee in November 1935. I'm 83 years old.
John, if you would, tell us a little bit about your parents and their backgrounds.
My mother, both my mother's parents were born in England, and they immigrated here in 1901 separately and married in this country. My grandfather came first, my grandmother a year later. They were already engaged, and he was in the cotton business and went totally bankrupt in the Depression and started again in the oil business and did very well. My mother was a musician. She went to the Cincinnati Conservatory of Music but had to drop out during the Depression, so she didn't finish that. But she taught piano for 30-something years. She was a church organist, and when she was 88 years old, she could still play wonderfully.
Wow. How about your dad?
My dad was born in Shelbyville, Tennessee. His parents were blue-collar people, came from a farming community. His father was employed by a buggy company. They made buggies. That was my grandfather. My father got into the produce business and ended up owning a seed and feed store in Columbia, retail, where he sold seed to farmers and bought seed from farmers, and he bought wool and a lot of things like that. That business folded after the war when the farmers' co-ops came in, and he then worked for a wholesale seed company and traveled the Southeast as a buyer for them.
Did you spend your whole childhood in Columbia?
I did. I grew up in Columbia, a wonderful town to grow up in the 40s. It was during the Second World War. I lived in a neighborhood where we could play outside at night and did that. All our buddies rode bicycles and played baseball and football in the vacant lots. And I had a wonderful childhood, boyhood experience. And many of my friends are still alive, and we get together.
I'm guessing that you probably grew up with a few attorneys we would know.
Well, one in particular, Tom Peebles and I started the first grade together and went through all of Columbia High School. He, of course, was a prominent lawyer here and died just a couple of years ago.
When you got to high school, John, at Columbia, any particular items that you did well in school, areas?
I was not a scholar in high school. By that I mean I was always smart enough to get by and do fairly well on grades, but I was not a particular scholar. I did well in most subjects, I think.
Sort of across the board.
Sort of across the board, yeah.
Okay.
I had a lot of friends, and I enjoyed athletics and doing other stuff more than I enjoyed books.
Tell us a little bit about the athletics. What did you play?
Well, I was not a prominent player, but I played at basketball and at football. But when I finished high school, I was only about 6 feet tall and only weighed about 130 pounds. So the coach persuaded me to be the manager of the team in my senior year. So I was converted from a star athlete to the manager of the team. But I got a letter.
Very good. That's the important thing. How about brothers and sisters?
I have a brother 2 years younger. I have 2 sisters that are each 2 years below that. I was one of 4. I was the oldest of 4. All of us 2 years apart. We're all still alive, and we all still get together regularly. And we all have big families.
Wonderful. In growing up, especially in the high school years, in the summer times, did you work?
I worked all the time. I had a paper route when I was 10 years old, and got up early in the morning to carry papers. And I had a paper route all the way through junior high school, carrying the Daily Herald, carry it every day and collect on Saturday. And then I started working in a supermarket after school and on Saturdays. I worked in a meat market for 3 or 4 years. Hill's store in Columbia. This was back in the...
We had Hill stores here in Nashville.
I still
too.
got them. H.G. Hill.
Yep.
And this was in the late 40s and very early 50s. And on Saturdays, I spent my whole time cutting up chickens. I could cut up a chicken in 19 seconds.
Wow.
Believe it or not, and put it in a package and put it out to sell.
Well, your dad was in produce, so you know.
But so I worked all the time, and then in high school, the coach made me put me in charge of the main public playground in Columbia. So I worked for the city in the summertime as manager of the city park, and I would, help little kids play ball and take care of the tennis courts and all that stuff.
Last question about high school. Did you have any leadership positions during high school?
Well, I was president of the senior class, and we had a very strong class. As a matter of fact, last summer we had our 65th class reunion, which I put together, and we still had about 50 people attend from that class. So
that's great.
We had about 170 something in the class to start with. So.
That's fun. John, let's now turn to what you began thinking about as you got into your senior year in terms of education.
We were very, very active in the Baptist church. My family was. My grandparents, my parents. And when I was about 16, I was persuaded that I should be a minister. And I felt the call to do that. And so my father obtained catalogs of all the Baptist schools around, and we selected Wake Forest as a place I should go to college. It's the only place I applied, and I was accepted and started there as a pre-ministerial student in 1953 when I finished high school.
What was Wake Forest like, John?
Wake Forest is a wonderful place and still is. It was a very small school then, still very small. Even today, it's the very smallest school in the NCAA major colleges. It only has about 5,000 students now.
Really?
And at that time, it had about 1,500.
Okay.
But it's the smallest school in the ACC, the SEC, and all of those. It was a small liberal arts school, very liberal, much more liberal than the church I had grown up in, even though we didn't know that at the time. But it had a huge influence on me, my life, the way I think, and I've stayed in touch with Wake Forest. I've been on several committees and commissions and stayed very close to the school.
In terms of your actual courses, anything that was of special interest to you, or teachers?
I
that
think
were,
teachers there were, yeah. I had a history professor, very influential, named David Smiley. I had a philosophy professor, A.C. Reed, who really got me thinking outside the box, as we would say now, but examining my beliefs, my whole core lifestyle,
Right.
and that was very important.
During your summers in undergraduate school, what did you do?
During those summers, I was still working as superintendent of the park in
Okay.
Columbia. Now, one summer, the last summer, I needed to make more money, and I worked as a laborer at the National Carbon Company plant there, just as a common laborer
Right,
guy.
right. So let's kind of get close to 1957 when you graduated. What was sort of going on in your head? Were you still headed towards the ministry?
I was still headed toward the ministry, but not a typical Southern Baptist ministry. And I chose to apply to Yale Divinity School, which is sort of anathema to Southern Baptists. But I was accepted at Yale and attended there from 1957 and graduated there in 1960.
What's it like for a Murray County boy to walk onto the campus of Yale University?
Not as frightening as you think.
Really?
You know, I'd come from a very good school, and I didn't know what it would be like, but I felt like when I got there that I was, could hold my own with about anybody and argue with about anybody and be run over by about anybody. But it was comfortable. I really enjoyed it. I think it's a good thing for students to get out of a geographical environment, really, and get into another totally different place.
Right.
And there's no doubt that the Ivy League is a totally different experience. Maybe less now than it was then.
During Wake Forest and then at Yale, were your grades good?
Yes, they were good.
I had a feeling, because I know that you graduated at the top of your law class, that you had become a real student.
I became a better student all the way through. I was a better student in college than I was in high school, and actually better at Yale and in law school than I was earlier.
Any persons or events that really shaped your 2 or 3 years at Yale?
Not really. I think being in class with some very prominent theologians and thinkers and social people. William Sloane Coffin was there at the time, and he was a friend of mine. Richard Niebuhr was a professor of mine. Paul Tillich lectured there some.
Boy, those are the prominent names
right,
of that period.
And having access to people like that and being able to talk to them, and but no single person jumps out.
Were you still coming back to Columbia during the summers, or did you work
Yes,
elsewhere?
I was. During the summers then, yes, I was coming back.
Now, something I haven't asked you anything about, but were you dating anyone during that period?
I dated in college, many different people, but in my junior year, on my return home that summer, I found a very attractive girl, picking up her brother at my house, and I inquired as to who she was and got her name and asked her for a date, and she turned me down. But she later repented of that and accepted the next time I asked, and we have now been married for 60 years. So we met in 55 or 56.
Okay.
And we married in 58.
While you were at Yale.
We married after my first year at Yale.
Okay.
And she was there my last 2 years, and we had our 60th anniversary last August.
Well, we're going to come back to it in a moment, but what was your wife's name?
My wife is Linda Lou Ward Wagster.
And she's a good Columbia girl, too.
She is a Columbia girl. She went to Vanderbilt and finished in 3 years, hurrying up so we could get married, really. And she was Phi Beta Kappa, and I think salutatorian of her class, and she was a math major. When she got to New Haven, she got a job immediately teaching in a school adjacent to Yale. It was a girls' school, Prospect Hill School for Girls, and it was made up almost entirely of daughters of Yale faculty.
Mm-hmm.
She was, at that time, 20 years old, and she was teaching calculus to her seniors who were 18 years old, and she was already a graduate of Vanderbilt. So she taught there, and then later, we may get into that.
And you got your theological degree in about 1960?
60, that's correct.
Okay. Mm-hmm. Well, what did you and your wife decide to do?
We accepted an invitation to be pastor of a church in West Virginia, in southern West Virginia, in Greenbrier County, not too far from the Greenbrier Hotel, on the Greenbrier River, in a town of Alderson. It's a very old town and a very old church. It was a church, actually the oldest church in that whole area. It was also a fairly large church for that size community. It was a church of about 1,000 members. And we've...
1,000?
Yes. And we went there in 1960. And it was a wonderful experience for me and my wife. Both our children were born there. It was a wonderful old town with sort of a aristocratic top, and but a welcoming of all classes. And we were there for 6 years.
That's a long stay. What about? Well, tell me a little bit about the challenges of being the minister at a Baptist church, and some of the things that were interesting about your years there.
You're asking some really good questions. If I ever took time to write a book, I guess I'd start with that. But my views, my theological views, were not like the ones they had, and I tempered what I believed to try to fit the situation there. I was very much interested in social work, doing things in the community, and I was headed up a drive to establish a youth organization supported by the city. In fact, we had a tax levy passed to support this Alderson youth organization that would have a place for them to meet and play, a pool room, ping pong tables, card tables, something that was never there. And I was interested in doing things in the community. That was, I guess, probably my primary interest, and the primary interest, I guess, of my theological education is you don't just do something on Sunday. You try to get out and do something in the community and make the community better.
Was Alderson in the coal belt?
It's on the edge. A lot of our people worked in the coal mines.
Okay.
Yes. But there were no coal mines there in Greenbrier County.
Right.
But it's a couple of counties over.
Right. You and your wife had your 2 children, and of course, you began raising them during this period when
Yes.
you were a minister in West Virginia.
Yes.
So what happened, John, as you approached your 5th or 6th year? Did you want to go somewhere else?
Well, probably 2 years before I finally left there, I decided I wanted to do something else. It's possible that I always knew I would never do that my whole life. I mean, at least when I was at Wake Forest. But I was going to do it for a while, and I did, and I'm glad I did. It was good for me. I think I still hear from people in Alderson. Believe it or not, they were the kids when I was there. They were the kids that I was really interested in, but I'm still hearing from them. But I think I knew I wasn't going to do this my whole life. So I took the LSATs a couple of years before I left and did very well on those. And then in 1970, I decided to, 67, I decided to go to law school, and I applied at Vanderbilt and was accepted.
Before we get to Vanderbilt Law School, while you were in Alderson doing your job with the church, being the chief minister, was your wife working in the community?
No.
She was with the children.
She did not work. She had the kids, and that was a big job. She was having babies and raising babies, and our house was right next door to the church, so I wasn't too far away.
Everybody's got a reason why they went to law school. Why did you go?
I guess it's part of what I was doing. Basic reason I became a lawyer was to help people. That's what I wanted to do. That's what I felt I had committed to do with my life, was to help people. And I felt then that being a lawyer was a better way to do it than being a professional clergyman.
Was it what you expected it would be?
Only in part.
Okay, because you were right behind me. I graduated in...
You were 1 year ahead of me. I remember
69.
you. I remember you in law school, yes.
And you had the unusual sort of position, I guess, at law school, is that you were a good deal older and more mature than a lot of the other folks that you were your classmates.
I was 10 years older than everybody in my class.
Yeah.
That was a big advantage. Plus, I'd been out in the world for 10 years, and I had run into the worldly problems and complications and kind of had a better grasp of what that was like than most people right out of school.
Did you know what part of law practice you wanted to go into, or did that develop during school?
I guess both. I always felt like I would be in the area of settling controversies. So I always thought I would probably be a trial lawyer. But that did increase, that idea did increase during law school.
What professors would you like to mention that really had an influence on you?
I think Hartman is one who became a good friend. Dean Wade certainly was a very close, he became a close friend, and Hartman was a good friend also. We had a guy that was there only my term named Bruce Gagnon. You remember Gagnon?
Yes, I do.
Gagnon was a guy right out of Harvard Law School. He taught for 3 years, brilliant. He was actually younger than I was, but we became good friends. He and his wife used to come to our house, and we went to there. That helps your grades.
That doesn't hurt. John, I'll confess that unfortunately, I never got to really know John Wade personally. Tell me what it was that made you and he friends, and sort of, was it a philosophical outlook or what?
I think so, probably. John Wade was the most dedicated, one of the most dedicated teachers I've ever met, and also dedicated to the profession. He was so highly respected around the country. I was on the Uniform Law Commission with him, and on one occasion we had a meeting out in California, and we would drive he and his wife around. We were in Yosemite National Park at an overlook, and a car drove up, and this guy got out and said, "Aren't you John Wade?"
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
but with the uniform law people, he was like a icon. He was
Right.
he was so respected. But he carried Vanderbilt Law School on his shoulders at almost no pay.
Yeah.
In the worst times.
Yeah.
He was injured severely in World War II.
He was in the Bataan Death March,
In the
wasn't he?
Bataan March, and he worked for almost nothing just to keep the school going when it was necessary. And he was also the guy that got these prominent professors from Harvard and other places to come in and teach at Vanderbilt after they had retired at their other places. Morgan and Cheatham and guys like that.
And during the period that you and I were students there, late 60s, Vanderbilt was beginning to come into its reputation.
Yes, and that's when they really started their so-called national
Yes.
movement, and was reaching out and recruiting. You know, my class probably had 15 or 20 people from the Ivy League, from Harvard and Yale and Dartmouth, and yours probably had some too.
Had a few.
But that was the first time John Beasley kind of led that
Yeah.
charge to go up and bring in people from all over the country. And Vanderbilt was becoming more than just a regional or Tennessee school at that time.
You know, the fact that you graduated #1 in your class and were the editor of the Law Review speaks for itself. Do you think it was an advantage to have been out in the world
Oh, of
before you
course.
went?
Of course it was, yeah.
Yeah.
Let me just tell you that I was amazed after my first semester when I ended up first in the class, and they posted me as first in the class. I had no idea. But the questions, of course, the matters of the tests then were issue spotting and identifying what the problem was, and then giving possible answers. And spotting problems was not too hard for me. I'd seen a lot.
Were there any events or special things that happened during law school that you would like to remember?
Well, in my class we had a group of guys. This is the first time I'd ever really partied, so to speak. I'd been a cleric and in a church, and I hadn't really gone to law school type parties. But I did, and Linda and I did, and we enjoyed that. And we had a group of friends that we called the hardcore. that partied together, and had a lot of law school friends, and still in touch with a lot of those.
You know, you were married, and so was I in law school.
Yeah.
Did you work while you were going to law school?
In the not during the year. My wife began her teaching career again when we came back to law school. She applied for and got a job immediately as a teacher and taught at Hillwood High School for a while, and later some other places. But she was teaching, and in the summers, the first summer, I worked for Hooker and Willis as a clerk, and kind of caught on with them and worked there the second summer also, and then joined that firm after I graduated in 1970.
To help people listening to this who may not be like you and I and know Nashville Bar very well, who were the lawyers at Hooker and Willis?
Well, the principal lawyer was John J. Hooker, who
Junior.
Junior, yes, who had run for governor already once when I got there, and who ran again in 1970 in a very hard-fought campaign and lost to the first Republican governor Tennessee had had since Reconstruction, I think. But he was a politician primarily at that time, although he was a very, very brilliant lawyer. His brother was Henry Hooker, also a brilliant lawyer. And the third partner, main character there, was Bill Willis, who became my mentor and very, very close friend for the next 6 or 7 years.
Right.
And I was more in touch with Willis and his practice than the Hookers. The Hookers, when I got there, the Hookers were just beginning a mini pearl chicken company that devoured a lot of their time for and interest in not really the practice of law.
Were you one of those lucky people who got the initial stock in Mini Pearl?
No, I was not allowed to buy any.
I'm sorry, John. Very good. Well, you know, you graduated #1 and you joined Hooker and Willis as a firm. Tell us a little bit about your first years in practice and what you remember and what you enjoyed.
Well, I think what I enjoyed most was the camaraderie, the friendship, and being around lawyers who were good at what they did and who were willing to discuss with me anything I wanted to talk about. In the firm then or soon thereafter was Bill Willis, of course, Al Knight,
Yep.
John Chambers, Bill Barr, and it was a very close-knit group. But Bill Willis was by far the best teacher of how to be a lawyer that I was ever around.
It was my great pleasure to know Bill and to have a lot of cases with him, and I 100% agree.
Yeah. Well, he was a tremendous person with a wonderful personality, very combative, but also very loving and agreeable. You could fight with him and then hug him. You know, he was that kind of guy.
Go have a drink and
Go have a drink.
talk
yes.
about it. Yeah. Tell us a little bit about the other lawyers. Hooker and Willis changed to another firm, and I'd like a little profile on the people that you were practicing with.
The Hookers sort of pulled out and were doing business deals and were out of the firm, and it became Willis. Get it straight. I guess it was first Willis, Knight, Chambers, and Barr.
Right.
And that it remained that for a number of years, and then Barr left and Chambers left, and it became Willis and Knight, and ended up as Willis and Knight for the last few years. That was really after I left in 1976.
So you were there for about
6 years.
years.
Yes.
Yeah. What was Al Knight like?
Al Knight became really probably my best lawyer friend. We were very, very close. And Al Knight was a tremendous intellect. You probably know he wrote about 5 books.
Yeah.
And a thoroughly ethical lawyer, very bright, and very devoted to what he was doing. He's the guy you wanted on your side if you had a bad problem. And he became a very good friend, not just then, but until his death. His last year, he was unable to walk around, and I picked him up in my car every week and took him out to lunch in his wheelchair. But
And he, like Bill Willis, he was a person who tried lawsuits.
yes, they both tried
knew,
lawsuits.
and knew trial law.
They knew trial law, and that's what they did.
How about John Chambers? I think he was a little
Chambers
different.
was more of a business type lawyer. Chambers recently died. He was a good friend also. Well, we used to say if Chambers wrote a book, it would be Chambers on Continuances. He's the guy you wanted if you wanted a slow walker.
How about Bill Barr?
Bill Barr was a bombastic guy, also bright, but very volatile. Had a big personality. You either liked him or you disliked him pretty intensely. I liked him.
What was it like to practice in Nashville in those, the 1970s? What did we have there?
You know, looking back, Gareth, I would say that it was fun. Fun in the sense that this is sort of the early practice. My early days of practice was sort of what I expected. You worked hard on your cases. You go to the courtroom and fight it out, and you could come back and have a drink with your adversary. There was more of a feeling of you were adversarial, but there was more of a feeling of connection between you and your opponent. I mean, you were both doing your job. Even though you're in court against each other, you're both doing a job.
Well, you knew them.
But you knew who he was. That's
Yes.
right. And the Christmas parties, for instance. At Christmas, many firms had Christmas parties, and everybody was invited.
Yeah.
Everybody, every lawyer in town, and I don't know how many there were, but let's say 300 or 400, maybe.
The week before Christmas, there was one every night at some place.
I know. I mean, 300 or 400 lawyers.
Yeah.
But it all circulated, and everybody saw everybody, and had goodwill with everybody.
Yeah.
That disappeared later, but in the early days, it was fun.
It was
It's fun being in a firm too, a small firm, and this was a small firm, where at the end of the day you could sit around a table and have a drink, and everybody talk about their cases and talk about their whatever's going on in their lives and a ball game or whatever, and that sort of disappeared. It didn't, not in our firm, but in a lot of firms.
Yeah. Well, the bar was still reasonably small when we began practice,
Yes.
but it changed a lot over the next
Oh, yeah.
15 or 20 years.
Yes.
Got much larger.
Much larger, and lawyers were more distant and not even interested in being friends.
Well, they didn't know. They didn't know what a wonderful thing it
I
was
think
to have that relationship.
That's probably it.
Yeah.
That's probably it.
Well, tell us, it's just been a few minutes, and talk about your personal practice, sort of how you got started in the beginning and where that led you.
Okay. Looking back and at my practice, what I really liked about it then, I think, and now, was the diversity. I was a trial lawyer, and that's almost all the cases I had were in controversy, and your job was to advocate for your client or try to settle it or get it out of the controversy. But in that context of being a trial lawyer, I had many different kinds of cases. I had a securities case. I was plaintiff lawyer in a class action securities case in federal court. I represented defendants in antitrust cases. And I was involved in the bid rigging case. I had two clients, one in Knoxville Federal Court and one in Nashville in the bid rigging cases back in the early 70s.
So you did some criminal practice as well as civil.
I did criminal practice. I was appointed by Judge Gray to represent people in criminal. I knew Judge Gray. He and I were initiated in the Order of the Coif together in law school, and I knew him, and he appointed me in some very interesting criminal cases. But I did the criminal antitrust cases. I had a lot of real estate cases, real property cases. I had had a reverse condemnation case that when I represented a landowner who was injured by the city because we claimed they took over his property when they let sewage run all through it, and we won. I had just a very diverse practice. My main practice, or my biggest part of my practice, was representing insurance companies in arson cases. And somehow I began.
How did you get into that?
Well, I had a case for State Farm Insurance Company in probably my first year. And they liked me and kept sending me these homeowners cases. And there were all kinds of those, slip and falls and all kinds of stuff. And then I got into representing State Farm in arson cases where somebody had burned down their house and they didn't pay, and you had to fight off the lawsuit. And I've had dozens of those all over Middle Tennessee, all over Tennessee, really.
And that's got to be an interesting and exciting practice.
It's very
you're
exciting
looking for clues.
And that led to other insurance companies calling me to defend them in these arson cases. So at one point, the insurance companies got together and decided they needed a state organization, and they wanted me to start it up. So I did the original charter and started up the Tennessee Advisory Commission on Arson, and which was chartered, and I think I was the first president at the request of my clients. And as a result of that, I lectured at a lot of these arson seminars where the insurance companies were trying to teach their adjusters and other lawyers how to defend arson cases, first recognize arson and then defend.
Yeah.
And I developed a speech that I could use everywhere and did use everywhere as representing in the Tennessee Advisory Commission on Arson.
I had no idea you had done that. How about? And I know I'm getting ahead of us, but when you look back, do you have any idea how many cases, jury cases, you actually tried in your career?
I was asked that question just before I quit practicing, and I calculated that I had in the neighborhood of 350 jury cases.
By today's standards, that's astronomical.
That's picking a lot of juries.
That is.
But that's over 40 years. So,
What judges did you appreciate the most or come to
Boy.
like the most, John?
Let's see how many of them are dead. The judges that I really liked to be in front of, that I thought were really good judges, Tommy Wiseman, John Nixon. They would let you try your case, and some judges like to intervene and try it for you or take over the case. Kurtz was good. Now in Chancery Court, of course, Drewota and was excellent here.
Yeah.
The trial judges, Jim Swigert, I thought, was a good judge,
Right.
and was very smart, could follow your argument.
Sometimes he would make you nervous, but in the end, he usually landed on the ground.
That's right. Well, it's interesting. Sidelight. When I was still a clerk, Willis had a case by a guy who didn't want to wear a motorcycle helmet. He'd been arrested for not having a helmet. And he hired Willis to take that to court. And Willis, I was a clerk, and Willis said, Wagster, you know what you're doing, so how about you do the brief and get this up? So I did a brief, and I found some cases where some states had held it unconstitutional that the state had no reason to make people wear a helmet. So I presented my case, and we went in front of Swigert, and Swigert bought it. Swigert heard all these arguments from these other states, and he said, yeah, that's right, I think it's unconstitutional. So he declared a Tennessee statute unconstitutional, which is kind of hard for a trial judge to do. That case had an immediate appeal to the Supreme Court because of a constitutional issue. So my very first month in practice, I was in front of the Supreme Court arguing that case.
How did it come out?
I lost. The Supreme Court didn't buy it at all.
John, there's another whole segment of your practice that I think began in 1976. You made a change in your law firm, didn't you? Didn't you go with John Hollins?
In 1976, John Hollins and I started a firm, yes.
Tell us about John and why you went with him.
Well, it's interesting. I didn't really know John well at the time. He told me that he had talked to some judges and had asked about some good trial lawyers that he thought the judges thought might be willing to join with him. And at that time, I'd been with Willis a while, and their situation was a little unstable, so I joined John, and we started to practice, and immediately almost Ed Yarbrough joined us. Ed Yarbrough is, of course, a very, very fine lawyer.
Yes.
So we had three guys who were good lawyers, and we had a three-man firm, and we took whatever walked in the door, and it was really fun, starting a.
Was your firm at the old Third National Building from the
Yes, we started
get-go?
at the old Third. Yes,
Right.
that's right.
Right.
We were on the floor with Jim Neal's office, and we even kind of shared some of their equipment and stuff.
Well, John is a legend in himself, but I think he did both civil and criminal work.
Initially he did criminal. He had been with the DA's office, and toward the end he did almost all domestic relations divorce work. But he did both. Yes, he did both, and had some criminal practice while we were together. Not a whole lot, but some.
How about Ed Yarbrough?
Ed Yarbrough, of course, is a very, very strong lawyer, and he did both civil and criminal, and probably better known for his criminal work,
Right.
and later became U.S. Attorney, of course. But Ed had a lot of good clients, interesting clients, and did excellent work.
Then eventually you had another sort of major addition or two to the firm.
Jim Weatherly joined us. He had been public defender, and he joined us as a trial lawyer. And then David Rabin, who became a very prominent criminal lawyer, joined us. David then did almost all criminal work. Weatherly did mostly civil trials, but did also still did some criminal stuff.
So you had a lineup of some of the most prominent trial lawyers in Nashville.
We thought we had a very good lineup of lawyers, yes. And what that allowed was we got referrals from firms that had conflicts. If a big firm had two clients fighting each other, they had to farm them out, and they felt comfortable in sending them to us, one of them to us, because they knew we would represent them well, and that's how we got a lot of the business. But we had a reputation, I think, as being good trial lawyers.
Did you stay with that firm until you retired?
Yes.
And that would have been Gosh, how many years?
1976 until approximately 2010, when I finally, I think I shut down in 2008, but did pro bono work and kind of kept a little piece of the office until 2010.
Did your practice remain an interesting blend of work that you've described, or did it change any as you got on close to the turn of the century? And
You know, it changed some, yes. I still had a good cross-section of work, but I did, for instance, I was asked to, a judge called me and asked me if I would be the receiver for Mount Olivet Cemetery. Mount Olivet Cemetery had fallen upon hard times. Its owner had neglected to keep it up very well, and all the lot owners were complaining, and the state has some supervisory capacity over a cemetery, and they're required to have trust funds that are kept in order and used to maintain the cemetery, and all of this was coming apart. So the judge, Gaydon, called me and asked me if I would be a receiver, and I said, well, I haven't done that before, so I took the job.
that's a huge job, John.
So I was, it lasted, believe it or not, it lasted 10 years. But my job was to keep it running and to get it in shape so that it could be purchased by a strong cemetery company and then maintain its reputation. Mount Olivet is a very old and historic and important cemetery. I mean, it's nationwide. So I got it, and it was a slow process, but I had it for 10 years, and I was like the CEO. I bought and sold stuff and hired people and fired people and ran the place. And 2 or 3 times a week, I would drive out to Mount Olivet and look over the books and look over what was going on and check with all my employees and see if anybody had stolen anything they shouldn't have stolen.
Did you finally?
But it finally worked, and it was taken over by a company that ran it for a while, and then sold it to another national company, who has it right now.
Well, see, that's something that honestly I thought I knew your practice fairly well. I had no idea you had done that.
Well, unless you had somebody die and buried in Mount Olivet, you wouldn't know that. But believe me, while I was running it, a lot of people with grave sites out there knew who I was and called me up to tell me things weren't going very well.
Did you do any malpractice work?
No.
Okay.
I didn't.
You mentioned to me when we were talking before today that you had had a case that did involve Vanderbilt Hospital, I think.
Yeah. In the early 50s, the Rockefeller Foundation provided funds for an experiment at Vanderbilt. They used some traces of irradiated iron, and they gave it to women at the hospital who were in the free baby clinic. Vanderbilt at that time was during the war, really. I guess it's before the 50s. At that time, Vanderbilt was offering free treatment, free services for poor people who were having babies. And they had this tracer, and it was a nutrition study, and they were looking for iron uptake in blood and so forth. And it went on for, I don't remember, a couple of years. In the 90s, it was discovered by a law firm in California that a child had died of cancer sometime who was about 9 years old. And this law firm, this is a plaintiff's firm in San Francisco, they tracked down and found a couple of more cancer patients and filed a lawsuit claiming that this tracer bit of irradiated iron had caused cancer. And they filed a class action suit here. The Rockefeller Foundation hired me to represent them in that lawsuit. They had provided the money. The defendants were Rockefeller and Vanderbilt, who'd done the study, and Rockefeller who had funded it. And that case went on for 2 or 3 years and was finally settled.
That must have been fascinating. Did Bill Ozier represent Vanderbilt?
Bill Ozier represented Vanderbilt.
Right.
Exactly.
Right.
Right. And it was finally settled for, I thought they should have tried it, but New York lawyers were advising Rockefeller, and they don't try cases in New York the way we try them down here.
You didn't get your way.
No, no.
You have done something during your career that I imagine most lawyers in Nashville really don't know about, and that was 10 years of service in the Uniform Law Commission. How did that begin, and what did you do?
Okay. Lamar Alexander had become sort of a friend just in the practice. In 1980, actually, I was Bill Willis's associate in the Hooker campaign in 1970, and Lamar was the campaign manager for Winfield Dunn, who beat Hooker. And we met with Lamar a lot. This is back in the days when politicians would talk to each other, you know, and meet. We'd meet. In fact, we'd meet for breakfast about every week, just
Really?
see what was going on. That's true. So I knew Lamar, but he called me in 1980 and asked me if I would be interested in being Tennessee's law commission. The Uniform Law Commission is called the National Conference of Commissioners on Uniform State Laws. It's located in Chicago. It's a long-standing national organization. And they propose and try to get adopted laws that should be uniform among the states. The primary example of their work is the Uniform Commercial Code, which has actually been adopted by all states, and it makes uniform a lot of commercial activities, banking, a transfer of collateral, and all this kind of thing, which is very important. But there are many, many other areas where this is also important. Each state has some delegates to this commission, usually 3 delegates. Sometimes some of the bigger states have more. But Tennessee had 3 delegates, and he asked me if I would be one of Tennessee's. And John Wade, the Vanderbilt's dean, had been on the commission for many, many years and had a very prominent position with the commission. So John Wade and I and a lawyer from Knoxville, whom I can't remember, were commissioners. And we met once a year in a plenary session to adopt these laws or turn them down. And then we had committee meetings that worked on the various separate laws or proposals during the year. So I did that for 10 years.
And I guess you took part in the committee discussions and...
Yes, I did, and was actually chairman of some of the big sessions while I was there. But during that time, I met a lot of lawyers from around the country whom I still know, and actually who referred me cases. But Dean Wade had been on the commission for many years, and in his role as a professor of torts was very prominent.
Oh yeah. You know, and obviously this was a part of your becoming really a good friend of Dean Wade's.
Yes, yes.
Because you served
we became
together.
closer then because he was unable to drive at that time, and so my wife and I, we'd fly to most destinations. The meetings took place in different parts of the country. We would fly there, but then I would have the car and drive Dean Wade and his wife around to different places. Yes.
John, you know, if you don't mind, I'd like to ask about another aspect of your career and practice that you don't talk about a lot, but I know about because I served on the Legal Services Board. You did a lot of pro bono work.
Yes, I did.
And this, I guess, was a part of what you talked about a little while ago. You kind of wanted the ability to help people.
Well, yeah. Well, first, I think every lawyer ought to do that. I think it's part of. I know it's part of the reason I wanted to be a lawyer was to be able to help people who needed help, and certainly the people who can't afford lawyers need help also. So I think I've looked at this question. I think somewhere between a fourth and a fifth of my practice was pro bono. Yeah. Now, John Hollins didn't like that.
I understand.
Your law partners don't always like it when you're doing a lot of free work.
I do a lot of work for the church. They don't understand
That's
that
right.
either.
That's right. But I think it's important. And to be honest, when I look back at the cases I've had and think about cases that were fun and cases I'm glad I won or I was glad I was in, some of those pro bono work for poor people are some of the best ones.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Well, I wanted to note that, and thank you for the time you spent doing that. Nashville Bar Association. I think you also were very active in the bar.
Yeah, I was. I was on the board 3 times.
I don't know anybody else in the bar who's
Well,
been on the board 3 times.
Well, for some reason they kept asking me to do it, and I did, and it's an interesting part of what I did.
How has the Nashville Bar Association, just strictly in your opinion, has it been good for Nashville? Has it helped the bar?
Yes, it's changed, and you may agree with this, or may not. Initially, I think what the Bar Association did was bring lawyers together in a congenial social setting. That's the way it was sort of when we started. And then it became more of a little operating corporation in itself. And it initially, the president had a secretary that was financed by the bar, who
Right.
kind of wrote letters and did scut work. Now the bar has, 20 employees probably?
Well, they've got a number.
A whole lot.
And doing a lot of different things.
That changed when they got a professional manager, and then they had several different people doing several different kinds of things, and a whole bevy of people working there that had to be paid for, and then they got into the process of producing courses for CLE, continuing legal education courses, for which they charge, and it became kind of a necessity, I guess, to earn money to pay the people that they had earning the money. So that changed. So I think it does provide CLE work, and I think that's important. Now, I think my impression is that the social activities declined. Maybe I'm wrong, but I don't in my recent years, I don't think I enjoyed the get-togethers, the summer get-together and the winter dinner as much as I did when I was young.
And I'm not sure that that's so much a function of the bar leadership as it may be just a function of lawyers these days. I don't know.
Well, I agree. I guess I agree. I think it's a function of the size of the bar, I suppose, and the attitude of lawyers now.
Yeah. I think you and I were fortunate, at least in a good part of our practice, to have practiced at a bar that was fairly small, and you knew people. You
Yes,
knew the people you were
exactly.
trying cases
Exactly.
with.
Exactly.
How about the community? I know you've had leadership positions. Can you tell us a little bit about what work you've done outside of law?
Well,
in the
I've been active in politics some. I'm a Democrat, yellow dog Democrat, and I've been active in my church and in the church activities.
Where do you go to church? Tell us about
Go to
that.
Belmont United Methodist Church.
Okay.
It's in Hillsborough Village. You may know where it is.
I lived within a quarter mile
Yeah,
there growing up.
yeah, that's right.
And I think you served with the Richland Country Club board and
Yeah,
worked there too.
I've been on the board at Richland Country Club and very active there for many years. And I have, I got involved, I guess first through Bill Willis with children with disabilities. And I have been on the board of the Rochelle Center for disabled people. And I founded a group for our church, which is called Home Place, which was a housing community for women who were retarded. And I've been on both those boards. And I was once on the board of South Street Community Center, which I don't think exists anymore.
I don't think they do, but I knew it at the time.
Yeah, but I've been active in that kind of thing for my whole career.
If you don't mind, let's stop for a minute and let me ask you just to go back for a second. I wanted to talk about something that I know from talking to you you're proud of, and that is your wife's career and then your children and what they're doing.
Well, I'm very proud of my wife's career. She, as I told you, she got her first job. She never intended to be a teacher, but she needed a job when I was at Yale, and we had just married, and somebody had to support us. So she taught in New Haven, and that job was very much appreciated there.
Oh, yeah.
When I came back to law school, she applied for a job with Metro and became a high school math teacher at Hillwood, and was there for 7 years. And then she went back to Vanderbilt and got 2 master's degrees, MAT and an MA, on a scholarship. And she had already been graduated there, was already a Phi Beta Kappa graduate. And then she went to Antioch High School, where her calculus classes won the state math contest out of this blue-collar school, and they beat MBA and Harpeth Hall and Baylor and Macaulay and all the big prominent schools. As a result of that success, she was chosen in the very first faculty of Hume Fogg to put together the math department. So she was in the initial faculty of Hume Fogg Magnet School and was in charge of the math faculty there, and did the same thing, won all the state math contests. I forget the year, but she was one year the Metropolitan Teacher of the Year for her work there. And after she finished teaching, or actually started while she was teaching, but she joined the college board who does the mathematics, calculus,
Really?
teaching stuff. Yeah.
Yeah.
And so she then graded the calculus exams, the national calculus exams for 10 years, and for about 3 years was in the group that made them out and put on the whole program. So she's been very strong in all that.
That's quite a credit. That
Yes,
really
it
is.
is.
Now, are your children all mathematicians?
No, I don't think we produced any mathematicians.
Tell us about them.
But I'm very proud of my children. My son is a lawyer here with Frost Brown Todd. He doesn't do what I did. I don't think he knows how to find the courthouse, but
Tell us his name now before you go
his
on.
name is John S. Wagster.
Okay.
Different middle name. But he does mostly business law, and recently has gotten into the law of cyber currency and has become fairly expert in that. My daughter is a realtor, real estate broker, and she lives in a suburb of Philadelphia in Moorestown, New Jersey.
And what's her name?
She's raised her 3 sons there, all of whom are now marriage age, and one of whom has produced our 2 great-grandchildren, 2 great-grandsons.
Now, what's your daughter's name?
My daughter's name is Beth.
Okay.
Elizabeth.
Okay, and she lives in Philadelphia, and she has 3 children, so that's 3 grandsons.
I have 3 grandsons there, and my son has a son and a daughter who live here. My grandson here is employed in the logistics business, and my granddaughter here is about to begin the New York's NYU School of Social Work. So,
Wow.
starting next fall.
She's taken after some things that you're interested in.
A little, yes.
That's picked up
Well, I
on
think
that.
all of my kids have some. Yeah, I'm very proud of my family.
Well, before we get philosophical, I've got one other topic. I want to know about the most famous poker game in the history of the Nashville bar. And you were instrumental for about 25 years in this poker game. And tell us about how you got involved and what you guys did.
Well, this poker game had been going on about 40 years before I got in it.
I didn't know that.
Very, very old and distinguished poker game. One of your partners, Tyree Harris, had been in it maybe most of its life. I don't know.
Probably.
But somehow it's not ordinary, I guess, that a former minister would be a poker player. But I had a friend who was in the game, a couple of friends, Bill Crawford, and Sid Knight, and they persuaded me to attend and join, and I did, and so I was a regular. It was a Tuesday night poker game, and it met mostly in Tyree Harris's office, in your office. Sometimes it met in mine, and sometimes in other places, and sometimes it had to move for one reason or another. But it went on. There were probably about 12 or so regulars, of whom 8 or 9 would be there almost every week. And the game was every Tuesday night, and we would play until midnight or 1 o'clock. And there's one, but the money kind of had no home. It kind of moved around. I'm sure some people were perpetual winners and some were perpetual losers, but most of us probably just close to breaking even.
What were the stakes?
It was $2, $5 limit. I mean, it was a very
Modest stakes.
modest stakes, and it was a loose game. I mean, people would call when they knew they shouldn't, and play a hand that they knew they shouldn't be playing because they were only going to lose $10.
Did the dealer call the game? That is what it's going to be?
Yeah, that's right. The dealer
Okay.
called, and in the early days, it could be 5-card stud or 5-card draw or stud poker, 7-card stud. But in the later days, we kind of got down to Texas Hold'em, which was kind of the game that played most of the time now.
Right.
But it was fun. One famous night for me was for some reason, we didn't stop at midnight, and we kept playing. And my wife had to get up and go to school. She'd get up at 5 o'clock to get ready to go to teach school. And she woke up at 5 o'clock, and I wasn't there. And she began calling your office, and nobody answered the phone. And because everybody was scared to, I guess. And so she began to calling wives. And so she called Tyree's wife and Jim Neal's wife and Billy Crawford's wife, and all of them would reach across the bed and said, "No, he's not here either." So for several weeks, I got it from these guys. Wagster, can't you keep your wife from calling?
So let's go through now. You had Tyree Harris, that I knew very well, as one of my mentors, really, in practice. Delightful, very good lawyer.
Wonderful person.
Yourself. Who was Sid Knight?
Sid Knight was a stockbroker, and his nickname was Sidnoid. He was a regular.
And I bet you that Jim Neal got Sid into the game, because I
don't know. Neal was, of course, everybody knew Jim Neal, but he played quite often. Excuse me.
Sid's poker nickname was Sidnoid.
Can we stop?
More.
Okay.
Well, we were talking about the members of the poker group. Dave Rutherford was a longtime member and player. Bill Crawford, probably the best player, and was there for many years. John Cheadle played. Jim Neal. Jackson.
Bobby Jackson.
Bobby Jackson played. Wade Nelson played for a while.
Really?
Yeah.
I didn't know that.
And so
Vince Webby, maybe?
Vince Al Webby played a lot. Vince occasionally, but Al more often. Yeah.
Right.
So anyway, there's a core group of about probably 12, and of course lawyers move around a lot, so out of town. So we'd have 8 or 10 every night. It was fun. It was a lot of fun, and it's almost part of the camaraderie that existed in the bar.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
These guys, these were your enemies during the week, and you could play poker with them on Tuesday night. That game folded. I think it folded because everybody who didn't quit smoking died, but it did not resume and did not continue because I think there's just less interest now in maintaining this kind of fellowship among buddies.
When did the game sort of die out?
When Tyree died.
Okay.
And Tyree and Dave died about roughly in the same year, probably.
Right.
And that's when it died.
Who are the people that we haven't talked about or mentioned, John, that had a big impact on your career that you wanted to mention as influential?
I would, of course, Bill Willis, I guess, is probably this most, had the strongest initially. Mm-hmm. John Hollins, of course, was a very close friend we had our partnership for 30 years, and he was a very close friend, and we confided in each other and talked about our lives and the law. Another close friend was John Sigenthaler, who I got to know while I was in law school, actually, when Bobby Kennedy visited here, and I was invited to Sigenthaler's house and got to know him there. He actually it was suggested to Hooker and Willis that they hire me.
That was nice.
Yeah, and when my son was thinking about, my son lived in Paris for a couple of years at the Sorbonne, and he was coming back. He wanted to go to work in Washington, and Siegenthaler called Jim Sasser and got him a job with Jim Sasser, and
Wow.
from there he went to Georgetown Law School and became a lawyer, which Siegenthaler was involved in that, but he was a good friend. And
It's hard to find people that had as much influence on all the parts of our community as John Siegenthaler.
I agree.
It really is.
Unbelievable personality.
We don't try as many lawsuits as we used to.
No.
Mediation has become very prevalent. Your thoughts on trial law, where it's headed?
Well, there's almost no such thing as trial law now. I guess there's controversy law, but mediation is required and even compelled, almost. Sometimes just against the wishes of everybody, but I suppose it's working. I don't know. It's different. The practice of law is certainly different. I can't say I know a whole lot of people going into law school and coming out of law school, but my feeling is that people now are primarily interested in just making money. Whereas I think in our day, Gareth, there was a definite interest in doing something good for society. Now, I may be wrong about that, but that's the way it feels to me.
Yeah.
And the practice of law has become more like corporate law, like joining a corporation. You know, you come out now, you're looking for a job. It's like the old days. You're trying to go to work for IBM or somebody. And nowadays, when you come out, you're looking for a big law firm to hire you, and you fit into a slot that's already there for you. In our day, we thought, when we got out of law school, we thought we could do anything, and you could. And we could be trial lawyers, we could do business, we could incorporate things, we could run a cemetery, we could do a lot of different things. Nowadays, it seems to be slotted, and everybody gets into a slot and apparently stays there.
Well, you and I knew lawyers who did the whole thing. I mean, we knew lawyers who actually did banking work, did commercial work,
Absolutely.
and tried cases too. And
Did
that
it?
now is just not really
Does
possible.
not happen that way.
Yeah.
It cannot happen that way.
I don't think it can either.
And when you get out of law school, everybody's looking for a job with a big firm. I didn't want a big firm. I deliberately chose a small firm because I liked the atmosphere of a small firm.
And it gives you some flexibility in practice too. You're not
does.
expected to meet a certain
Yeah.
every month or something like that. Yeah. Well, John, it has been a pleasure.
I've enjoyed it.
I have enjoyed it greatly. Any other observations or things about your career that you wanted to bring up?
No, I think you covered it very well.
Well, it has been a pleasure and an honor, and thank you very much.
Thank you, Gareth.